There's a moment, and every person who has ever stood guard knows exactly what I'm talking about. There's a moment when you realize that the person you're protecting doesn't actually see you. Not really. They see a uniform, they see a function, they see a shape standing between them and the door. They don't see the person inside the uniform. I've been standing guard for 11 years. 11 years across 3 star systems, 4 diplomatic postings, and more council chambers than I can count on both hands. I've stood in rooms made of materials that don't exist on Earth. I've breathed recycled air that tasted like copper and old lightning. I've watched species argue in 47 different languages while I stood perfectly still with my hands clasped behind my back. And I said nothing, and I moved nothing, and I let them forget I was there. That's the job. You become furniture. Very expensive, very dangerous furniture, but furniture nonetheless. And most of the time, that's fine. Most of the time. But this story, the one I'm about to tell you, this one starts on a Tuesday. Or what passed for a Tuesday on Station Vale 9, which orbited a dim orange star that the Cavith called the Old Lantern, and we just called HR 4523. The station rotated slowly enough that you could watch the stars drift past the observation ports if you stood still long enough. I'd done it many times. It was one of the few things that still felt like something real. I want you to understand what Vale looked like before I get into what happened, because the setting matters. It always matters. You can't understand a moment without understanding the room the moment happened in. Vale was not a military station. That's important. It was a diplomatic nexus. A floating neutral ground roughly the size of a large sports arena, designed by the Interspecies Accord Commission about 60 years before I was born. The architecture was intentionally uncomfortable for everyone. The corridors were too tall for humans, too narrow for Gravathi, too brightly lit for Nocthurin, and too cold for most of the Cavith noble class. The IACC had decided, somewhat brilliantly, that if no species felt completely at home, then no species could claim advantage. The result was that everyone walked around slightly hunched, or squinting, or rubbing their arms for warmth, and this apparently created a kind of democratic misery that kept negotiations civil. I'd been stationed there for 8 months. My assignment was protection detail for the Terran diplomatic mission, 3 ambassadors, 2 cultural liaison officers, and a rotating roster of technical advisors who came and went every 6 weeks. My partner on most shifts was a woman named Sergeant Britta Hawes, who had done 2 tours in the Cavith border systems before taking this posting, and who had the unsettling ability to stand completely motionless for 6 hours without her expression changing even slightly. I admired her enormously. The station's population on any given day was somewhere between 800 and 1,200 individuals, representing maybe 30 species. The permanent staff, mostly Velhari, a species of tall, gray-skinned administrators who seemed to have evolved specifically for bureaucracy, kept things running. The diplomats rotated. The guards rotated. The arguments stayed the same. On the day this happened, the station was unusually full. There was a session of the secondary trade accord negotiations, not the big ones, but important enough that several noble caste delegations had come personally, rather than sending their usual proxies. This mattered because noble caste members of most galactic species operated under a completely different set of behavioral assumptions than their professional diplomat class. Professional diplomats are trained. Noble caste members are simply accustomed. There's a difference, a big one. The Cavith, specifically, had sent Lady Thessavorn Myrelder of the 3rd House of Caldris. I want to be fair when I describe her. I want to be precise, because I think imprecision would dishonor what actually happened. Lady Thessavorn was, by any objective measure, an impressive figure. The Cavith noble class stood an average of nearly 7 feet tall, with a build that was lean in a way that suggested extreme physical capability rather than fragility. Their skin was a deep iridescent blue-black that shifted color depending on the angle of light, and they had 4 upper limbs, 2 longer, articulated arms used for most tasks, and 2 shorter forearms that folded close to the chest in formal settings. Their faces were elongated, with large amber eyes that had horizontal pupils, and their voices were resonant in a register that human ears perceived as slightly below comfortable, not painful but persistent, like the feeling before a storm. Lady Thessavorn was all of that, plus the specific posture of someone who had been told from birth that rooms rearranged themselves around her presence. She had arrived with a retinue of 6, 2 personal guards, 2 advisors, and 2 attendants whose specific function I never quite determined. Her personal guards were Cavith military caste, built even larger than the noble frame, wearing ceremonial armor that was almost certainly also functional. They were, by any measure, formidable. And then there was me. I was assigned as the Terran Mission's liaison guard for the duration of the trade accord sessions, which meant I stood at the door of the primary negotiation chamber whenever the session included our ambassadors, and I escorted anyone entering or leaving who was moving through our designated diplomatic corridor. Standard posting. I'd done it hundreds of times. The incident happened on the 3rd day. The morning session had run long, by about 90 minutes, which was normal for these talks. I'd been standing at the chamber door since 700 station time, which put me at 4 hours and change when the recess was finally called. The delegates began filtering out in that particular way that diplomats have, still talking, still working the room, treating the walk to the refreshment station as an extension of the negotiation. I stepped aside to allow the flow of traffic. My job at recess was to maintain the corridor, log exits and entries, and make sure nobody went where they weren't cleared to go. Lady Thessivorn came through the door 3rd in the exit order, flanked by her 2 advisors. She was mid-sentence in what sounded like a pointed assessment of something one of the Velhari representatives had said, and her tone was the kind that assumed everyone around her was listening, processing, and taking notes. She stopped about 2 feet in front of me. I was in the corridor, standing to the side of the doorframe. She would have to step around me or I would have to step back. Standard social geometry. I moved to give her room. She didn't move, she looked at me. Not the way you look at a person. The way you look at something in your path that you're deciding whether to step over or go around. Then she said something. She said it in Cavith, which I spoke at what the mission rated as intermediate functional proficiency, meaning I understood maybe 70 to 80% of conversational speech and could follow most formal address. Her comment was not difficult vocabulary. It was quite simple, actually. She said, and I'm translating as cleanly as I can, she said, "Why do they still station these soft ones? They look like they'd fold in a mild wind." She said it to her advisors. She did not lower her voice. She did not look away from me while she said it. Her advisors made a sound that was the Cavith equivalent of polite laughter, a kind of resonant clicking at the back of the throat. And then they began to move past me. I want to describe what I felt in that moment, because I think it's important to be honest about it. I felt a very specific kind of calm. Not the calm of not caring, not the calm of being unbothered, the calm of someone who has experienced enough that new provocations settle into an established context rather than a chaotic one. Like when you've been cold enough times that you've stopped being surprised by cold. I understood exactly what she had said. I understood exactly what she meant. I understood that she had not intended for me to respond, because she had not expected me to understand her language, and because guards, in her experience, did not respond to offhand commentary from their betters. I also understood something else. I understood that in about 3 seconds, she was going to walk past me and that would be the end of it, and in 6 weeks I'd rotate to a different posting and she'd go back to Caldris, and the moment would dissolve into the general background noise of 11 years of similar moments. That was the most likely outcome. I made a decision. I don't know exactly why I made it. I've thought about it many times since. I think it had something to do with cumulative weight, the accumulated weight of 11 years of being furniture. Not just in this posting, not just with noble caste aliens, with everyone who had ever looked at me and seen a shape in a uniform, and maybe something specific about the way she'd said soft ones with such complete and effortless certainty. I spoke in Cavith. I said, "My lady, a moment if you would." She stopped. I want to be precise about this too. She didn't stop the way someone stops when they're surprised. She stopped the way someone stops when something has violated an expected pattern and their brain is still processing whether it actually happened. She turned. Her amber eyes, with those flat horizontal pupils, focused on me with an attention that was completely different from the dismissive scan she'd given me a moment before. This was actual attention. recalibrating attention. She said in Kavath slowly, "You speak Kavath." It wasn't a question. It was an observation she was making out loud while her mind updated several assumptions simultaneously. "Yes, my lady," I said, still in Kavath. "I apologize for the directness. I know it's not the form you're accustomed to from guard personnel, but you made a comment that I'd like to address if you'll permit it." The corridor had gone very quiet. This is the part that I think people who hear this story don't fully appreciate, so I want to paint it carefully. We were in the main diplomatic corridor of Vale 9. The recess from the morning session meant that there were perhaps 20-25 individuals in the corridor at that moment: delegates, advisors, a few station staff, 2 Velhari administrative officers, 3 other guards from different delegations. Lady Thessivorn's retinue, Ambassador Celia Dort from our mission, who had stopped about 15 feet away when she'd heard me speak. 25 people in a corridor that was designed to make everyone slightly uncomfortable. And it had gone completely silent. The Kavath guards behind Lady Thessivorn had shifted, not moved toward me, shifted. The kind of micro-movement that trained combatants make when their threat assessment has suddenly reclassified something from background to foreground. I noted it. I didn't respond to it. Lady Thessivorn said, "Address it then." She said it with a kind of amused condescension, which was fine. Amused condescension I could work with. At least it was engagement. I said, "You called us soft. Specifically, you said we looked like we'd fold in a mild wind. I want to offer you some information about where I come from because I think it's relevant to that assessment." She inclined her head, a fraction of an inch, the Kavath version of "go on." "I come from a planet," I said, "that the rest of the galaxy has decided to classify as a death world." I watched her face. There was a pause. The horizontal pupils didn't change shape, but something in the quality of the attention behind them shifted. The Kavath concept of death world was not identical to the human one, but it overlapped significantly. In Kavath scientific classification, a death world was a planet whose biosphere had developed under such extreme pressures that its dominant species had evolved to be functionally immune to conditions that would kill most other life within hours. She said Earth. Not a question, she knew. Of course she knew Kavath nobles were educated. She simply hadn't connected the person in front of her to the classification. Earth, I confirmed. She looked at me with more attention now, evaluating, re-evaluating. That classification is applied broadly, she said. It encompasses the general planetary conditions. It doesn't necessarily mean. My lady, I said gently, would you like me to tell you specifically why the classification is applied? Not in general terms, in specific terms, what we live alongside on Earth, what we've always lived alongside. The corridor was absolutely silent. She said yes. And so I told her. I didn't do it dramatically. I didn't perform it. I told it the way I would tell anyone, plainly, factually, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing the weather. I told her about the oceans. I told her that Earth's oceans covered about 71% of the planetary surface, and that they were home to creatures that had been evolving for hundreds of millions of years before anything with a spine had walked on land. I told her about the things that lived in the deep trenches, places in the ocean so far down that the pressure was equivalent to being crushed by a skyscraper, and that things lived there anyway. I told her about giant squid and the blue whale, which was the largest creature known to exist on any Class M planet in the catalogued systems. A creature so large that its heart was the size of a small vehicle, and its arteries were wide enough that a human child could swim through them. I watched her expression. She was listening. Her advisors were listening. Everyone in the corridor was listening. I told her about the things that weren't ocean. I told her about the surface fauna. I told her about bears, which she had heard of vaguely in the generalized way that comes from skimming taxonomy catalogs, but I told her about them specifically. I told her that a brown bear in full health weighed between 300 and 700 kilograms, could run at speeds that would outpace most wheeled vehicles on the station, had a bite force that would fracture the armored plating used in standard-issue Kavath Border Patrol vessels, and that they were, by Earth standards, a mid-tier predator. Not the top. Mid-tier. The lead Kavath guard behind Lady Thessivorn said something to his partner in a low voice. I couldn't quite catch it, but I heard the word for recalibrate. I told her about pack hunters. I told her about wolves, how they functioned in coordinated social units, how they could track prey across hundreds of kilometers, how they were capable of persistence hunting, which is the technique where you don't outrun your prey, you simply keep moving until the prey collapses from exhaustion, which humans had also done, for the same reasons, because wolves and humans had in certain ways evolved parallel hunting strategies on the same planet, and were in a biological sense direct competitors. I paused there deliberately. Wait, Lady Thesavorn said, slowly. You said you and the wolf parallel evolution direct competitors. On the same planet, I said, yes. We competed with apex predators for the same prey for most of our evolutionary history. We didn't win every time, but we're still here, and we've managed to, in recent centuries anyway, actually domesticate some of them. The wolves. We turned some of them into companions. The silence that followed that statement had a particular texture to it. It was the silence of people doing math and not liking where the math was going. I kept going. I told her about insects. Now I know how this sounds. Insects. What about insects? Insects are small, insects are everywhere, every planet with a biosphere has something that fills the insect niche. What could possibly be notable about Earth's insects specifically? And I explained. I told her about the bullet ant, found in certain regions of Earth's tropical zones, whose venom caused pain so intense that human researchers had actually developed a formal pain scale specifically to classify it, and that the bullet ant sat at the top of that scale, and that indigenous peoples of certain regions used the ant as part of coming-of-age rituals, where young men wore gloves filled with the ants and were stung hundreds of times, and the cultural expectation was that you didn't cry. I let that sit for a moment. Then I told her about the botfly, which laid its eggs under the skin of living mammals, including humans, and whose larvae grew inside the host's tissue, and that this had been happening on Earth for so long that it was simply a known hazard of being in certain environments, managed, dealt with, survived. Lady Thesavorn made a sound. It was very quiet. It was the Cavith equivalent of what a human might call a suppressed shudder. And you still go to those regions? She asked, not in her noble register now, in something plainer. People live there, I said. Full communities, cities, they adapt. They adapt to parasites that grow inside them. That's one of the things, yes. What are the others? I smiled just slightly. My lady, we haven't gotten to the microbes yet. The corridor, and I want to be clear that nobody had left. Nobody had moved. If anything, a few more people had drifted closer in the way that beings do when they sense something worth witnessing. The corridor made a sound that I can only describe as collective recalibration. It was the sound of approximately 25 individuals from multiple species, simultaneously updating their prior beliefs about the species they just heard called soft. I told her about bacteria. I told her about the specific, ongoing, perpetual war that the human immune system fights every single moment of every single day against the microbial population that lives in, on, and around a human body. And I told her that there were more bacteria in a single human gut than there were stars in most of the star clusters visible from the station's observation deck, and that most of them were not hostile, and that the ones that were hostile were constantly evolving new strategies to defeat our defenses, and that our defenses were constantly evolving new strategies to defeat them, and that this had been happening for so long and so intensely that the human immune system was, by any galactic medical standard, grotesquely overbuilt. Grotesquely, I repeated. That's the word our own medical researchers use. I told her about the specific phenomenon of autoimmune disorders, where the immune system, having evolved to fight at maximum intensity for so long, occasionally turned on the body itself because it couldn't find enough external threats to justify its capacity. It fights itself, one of the advisors said very quietly in Cavith. When it runs out of things to fight, I confirmed. Yes. The advisor looked at his colleague. His colleague looked back. Something passed between them that I couldn't fully interpret, but the rough human translation would be something like, "We may have severely miscalculated." Lady Thesavorn had not moved. She was still standing exactly where she'd stopped, 2 feet in front of me, and she was looking at me with an expression that I had not seen on a Cavith face before in 8 months of posting. It took me a moment to identify it, because the anatomy was different, but I think the closest human word for it would be humbled. Not humiliated, not angry, humbled. There's a difference. She said, how long has your species existed? In our current recognizable form, about 200,000 years. In earlier ancestral forms that were still technically human, closer to 2 million. And you've lived on this world, for all of that time. For all of that time. And you're still. She stopped. She seemed to be working through something, reorganizing something. And yet you appear physiologically. Soft, I offered. Her horizontal pupils contracted slightly. Not anger, something closer to chagrin. I was going to say unarmored, she said with careful precision. Physically unarmored compared to most apex deer species. Yes, I said. We are no natural armor, relatively slow compared to most things that hunted us. No venom, no claws to speak of, poor night vision, can't smell threat at distance the way most predators can. We're honestly, if you look at us on paper, we shouldn't have made it. And yet, I agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and this is the part I think about most when I think about that day, she said, what did you do instead? Instead of armor, instead of claws? What did you do? I think about this question a lot. Not because it's difficult to answer, but because of the way she asked it. There was no condescension left in it. There was genuine inquiry. There was the kind of intellectual curiosity that, in my experience, only emerges in people of any species, when they have run out of their prior explanations and need a new framework. She wanted to know. I told her. We thought, I said. We remembered, we talked to each other. We passed information forward across generations. Every time something killed us, and things killed us constantly in enormous numbers for a long time, we learned what it was. We remembered what it was. We told our children and our children's children what to watch for, how to avoid it, how to fight it if you couldn't avoid it, how to survive if you couldn't fight it. We built the knowledge up over thousands of generations, and we used it. I paused. We also built things. We looked at what we didn't have, armor, claws, venom, and we found materials that could serve those functions. We made our claws out of stone, then bronze, then iron, then steel, then things that don't have names in caveth yet. We made our armor out of leather, and then metal, and then composites that are still being developed. We made our venom out of chemistry that we researched for centuries. Every limitation we had, we built around, not through, around. Lady Thesavorn said, you compensated. We innovated, I corrected, gently. Compensation implies making do with less. We ended up with more. A bear has claws. A bear's claws are exactly as strong as the bear can grow them. Our weapons are not limited by our biology. We've built things that could kill a bear from 1,000 times the distance the bear could ever reach us. We looked at what the predators around us could do, and then we built things that did it better. The corridor was breathing very softly. And the predators, she said. The ones you mentioned, the wolves, the bears, the deep ocean creatures. Yes, they coexist with you. Currently on your planet. Most of them. We've lost some. Our history with other species on Earth is complicated and not entirely something to be proud of. But yes, many of them. We have wolves and bears and great white sharks and saltwater crocodiles and things that would genuinely alarm you, and we share a planet with them and have for as long as we've existed. And you go outside. We go outside, I confirmed. Knowing they're there. Knowing they're there. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at her advisors briefly, and they looked back, and then she looked at her guards. Her guards were big, 7.5 feet, heavy combat frame, caveth military cast, genuinely dangerous, by the standards of most species in the corridor. Their ceremonial armor was rated for serious hostile engagement. They were not soft by any measure. She looked back at me. At 5'11", in standard issue Terran diplomatic corps uniform, no visible armor, no visible weapons, those were under the jacket where they were supposed to be. She said, and this is what they send to guard your ambassadors, a Deathworlder. Yes, I said, my lady. One, often one, yes, sometimes two. We find it's usually sufficient. She didn't say anything for a moment. I'd like to say that I felt triumphant. I'd like to say that I felt vindicated or satisfied or some version of having won, but that's not what I felt. What I felt was tired, actually. A good tired. The tired of having said something true that needed saying, and having it land properly. Then Lady Thessevorn Milder of the third house of Caldris did something that I had never, in 8 months, seen a Caveth noble do. She inclined her head. Not the fraction of an inch she'd offered before, as go on. This was a full, formal inclination, the Caveth equivalent of a deep bow, the formal gesture of one who acknowledges that they have been corrected by someone with standing. She said in a voice that was very careful and very precise, "I spoke without knowledge. I should not have. I ask your pardon." The words were formal, very formal. In the Caveth Noble Register, asking pardon in public was not a small thing. It was witnessed. It was recorded in whatever internal social accounting the noble caste maintained. You didn't ask pardon lightly. I returned the gesture, a version of it, the human version, which is a nod and a slight tilt of the head that the IACC had established as the cross-species equivalent of the same acknowledgement. "No pardon necessary, my lady," I said. "Information is always useful." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, quietly, in a register that wasn't noble and wasn't formal, and wasn't anything I'd categorized in 8 months of listening to Caveth speech. "What's your name, guard?" "Warrant Officer Declan Hare," I said. "Terran Diplomatic Security Corps." "Hare," she repeated. "Yes, my lady." "You know what a hare is?" "The animals." "Yes, my lady." "Small prey animal, runs from predators." "On Earth," I said, "a hare can run at 72 kilometers per hour and change direction instantaneously. They've been surviving predators for millions of years. They're quite good at it." The very faintest thing moved at the corners of her eyes. On a Caveth face, I would later learn from my cultural liaison notes, that was the equivalent of a suppressed smile. "Of course they are," she said. "On Earth, of course they are." She walked past me then, continuing down the corridor. Her retinue followed. Her guards, the big ones, the military caste, went past me last, and the second one, as he passed, gave me a very specific look. Not hostile. Something that I'd seen on the faces of professional fighters before, from a dozen species. Respect, the clean kind, the kind that doesn't need anything attached to it. The corridor began to move again. I heard voices resume, low first, and then more normal, and then the specific busy murmur of diplomatic spaces getting back to their diplomatic business. I stood where I was at the door doing my job. Ambassador Dort came over. She was a small woman in her 50s, with short gray hair and the particular kind of calm that comes from decades of professional negotiation in hostile environments. She stood next to me and watched the corridor for a moment. Then she said, without looking at me, "That was either very stupid or very correct." "Which do you think, Ambassador?" She was quiet for a beat. "Very correct," she said. "But you should know that the Caveth diplomatic record logs all corridor conversations within the station." "I know," I said. "Which means this conversation will go into the daily summary." "I know. Which means it will reach House Caldris." "That was the point, Ambassador." She looked at me then, sideways, the corner of her mouth did something. "I'm going to need you to write a full incident report," she said. "Extremely detailed. Every word you said, every word she said, every reaction in the corridor. Don't leave anything out." "Yes, Ambassador." "And Hare." "Ambassador." "Well done." She walked back toward the chamber. I wrote the report. It was 43 pages. The incident summary went into the station's daily log, as Ambassador Dort had predicted. It also went into the Caveth diplomatic record, which meant it went to House Caldris, which meant it eventually reached the attention of several members of the Caveth Noble Council who had not previously given much consideration to the specifics of human biology and evolutionary history. Within 6 weeks, 3 separate Caveth academic delegations had filed requests with the IACC for extended cultural exchange access to Terran educational archives, specifically to the biology and natural history archives. Specifically, one of the request forms noted, with particular interest in the sections covering the documented threats and survival strategies of the species' home world. I was not there to see most of that. My rotation had ended. I was on a transport back to Earth by then for a 4-week leave before my next posting. I went home. I went to my mother's house in the west of Ireland, where the Atlantic came in off the ocean and the wind was cold even in summer, and I walked on the cliffs and watched the waves, and I thought about Lady Thesavorn asking me, "And you go outside, knowing they're there." And I thought about what a strange and remarkable thing it was to have grown up somewhere like this, to have breathed this air, with its salt and its cold, and watched these waves that had been eating coastlines for millions of years, and to have simply accepted it as the world. We go outside knowing they're there. Yes, of course we do. We always have. There's a postscript to this. About 4 months after my leave ended, after I'd taken a new posting, a border monitoring station on the edge of the Cavith sector, I received a formal communication through the IACC diplomatic channel. It was from Lady Thesavorn Myrlda. The message was brief, written in formal Cavith Noble Register, which the attached translation system rendered in precise, slightly stiff English. It said, "Warrant Officer Hare, I have had occasion to review the educational materials you referenced in our corridor conversation on Station Vale 9. I find I wish to revise my assessment of the standard Terran diplomatic guard posting from 1 to excessive. You are, collectively, far more than sufficient. I hope your deployment is favorable. TM." I kept that message. It's in a folder on my personal terminal. I don't look at it often. But sometimes on long shifts, when the hours are stretching out, and I've been standing still for so long that my legs have moved past ache into something that's almost peace, I think about it. I think about the corridor, the silence, 25 beings from 30 species all doing the same math at the same moment. I think about her saying soft with such certainty, and then slowly, phrase by phrase, losing that certainty. Not because I argued, not because I performed anything, just because I told her the truth about where I came from, just because I described the world plainly. That's all. Just the world described plainly. And that was enough. I've told this story to other guards since. Not to brag, I really want to be clear about that. I tell it because I think it's useful. I think it's useful to know that the most powerful thing you can sometimes do in a room is not be the biggest or the most armed or the most impressive. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply know where you come from and say it clearly and let the truth do the work. We are soft by some measures. By some measures, yes. But we are from a place that has been trying to kill us since the first cells divided in the primordial ocean, and we have been answering that challenge for 200,000 years, and we are still here. We go outside, knowing they're there, and we always come back.